Hello and welcome to Bright Blue. I'm your host, Max Anderson, and today we'll be discussing an event that has dominated British politics for the last 6 years, Brexit. 6 years ago, the UK, in a shocking result, decided to leave the EU, and in January 2021, we did just that. However, that is hardly the end of the story. As we face rising inflation and a stagnating economy, many have blamed Brexit for exacerbating the crisis. Of course, we must bear in mind that the Ukraine-Russian war has played a major factor in that, but many have said Brexit will continue and always will have a massive impact on Britain's economic future. So what are the commentators saying? On the one hand, Remainers would certainly point to exiting the European single market as only acting as a block on trade. However, Remainers are not the only ones frustrated, as some Brexiteers would argue we've simply replaced the EU for an overzealous red tape government. Or in fact, are both sides wrong, and it's just the legacy of EU laws that are holding us back? Or are we just looking for a problem that simply does not exist? And we should look at Britain's vaccine programme as an example of how life outside the EU is much more sunny. These are the questions that we'll be discussing today as we once again delve into the chaotic discussion that is Brexit. Joining me today is a fantastic panel. We have Director of the UK in Changing Europe, Anand Menon. We have Director of the Independent Commission on UK and EU Relations, Mike Buckley, and Financial Columnist for the Daily Telegraph, Matthew Lynn. So Anand, I want to start with you for my first question. Obviously, we need to kind of understand, I think the first question we would always ask is, what's changed, what's happened? So how far has the UK actually branched away from typical EU law at this point? And has this actually been beneficial for businesses?
First, thanks for having me. I think the honest answer to that is not very much yet, though for understandable reasons, because of course our departure from the EU was followed almost immediately by the COVID pandemic. So government had better things on its mind than figuring out what to do with legacy EU regulations. So not much has been done yet. And as you said, there's some frustration amongst Brexiters about how little has been done. There are some areas like agriculture where actually some quite good changes have been made as a result of us leaving the European Union, but nothing yet. And we'll wait to see what happens in financial services, where there's going to be a significant economic impact, I don't think.
All right, Matthew, I'd like to come to you as well. I mean, we do actually have quite a few Tories almost wanting us to move closer back towards the EU. I know Tobias Ellwood has called for us to rejoin the EU single market. Do you think this is even a possibility that the Prime Minister can pursue, or whoever the new Prime Minister will be? But do you think this is something they should pursue, or should we just continue marking our own way forward?
Well, assuming the new Prime Minister is Liz Truss in a couple of weeks' time, if she decided to rejoin the single market, I mean, it'd be a heck of a scoop. I think it would make the front page of my newspaper and quite a few others, and would get a few jaws dropping if that was her first announcement on standing on the steps of number 10. But I don't think that's a very realistic possibility. Listen, I kind of agree with just what how we kicked off the discussion. I mean, we haven't had a huge amount of change. There've been a few changes since we left the EU, not a huge amount of change. I mean, I'd try to I think we have to take a fairly long-term perspective on it. I think from the way I look at it, if you think about Britain within the EU, we had about 45 years of member, and it was a slow process in which we converged more and more to European standards and had more and more European law. That happened. That wasn't really happening in 1980. 1985, it took quite a long time. And my feeling is that probably leaving will be, a similar quite long process. It'll be a process of divergence, but it may well take 10 or 20 years. I know lots of people, probably a little bit more on my side of the debate, were hoping for a big bonfire of regulation. I'd probably, I'm the kind of person who think that'd be quite good. There was a bonfire of regulation somewhere on the steps of Whitehall, but realistically, that's not the way the UK works. I don't think that's going to happen. We got plenty plenty of bureaucrats of our own who impose their own slightly pointless regulations, and that'll carry on. I think there will be a steady process of divergence, and I actually think the way that we'll benefit from Brexit over 10 or 20 years will not be so much ripping up the old rules. It's really, really hard. Everyone knows it's really hard to rip up old rules. There's so many vested interests and so much resistance to it that it tends to get bogged down. But I think what will happen is the EU will generate lots of new rules, and the UK won't sign up to them. And over 10 or 20 years, that'll be beneficial. So just to take a kind of slightly random example, the EU has rules coming in on artificial intelligence, big, exciting growth into this future. And in my opinion, they're a terrible set of rules and regulations, ridiculously heavy-handed and restrictive, and will damage a European AI industry emerging. And hopefully, actually, what we will see is the UK, the EU will have those regulations, and the UK will say, okay, that's great, that's fine. The French and the Germans can do what they like. It's not for us. And then we'll see that we'll be able to, a bit like some other countries outside the EU, which have tended to grow faster and have better tech industries and so on. We'll see, faster growth and slightly better new industries. But it'll be a 10, 15-year process. It's not going to be something that happens overnight.
Mike, would you kind of agree with that assessment in kind of what Matthew said?
Well, I mean, the pro. I mean, I'm here with a neutral hat on as we're in the Independent Commission. We don't take a view on Brexit or not Brexit, but just to come back on what Max said. I mean, from the pro-Brexit viewpoint, it's always jam tomorrow. It's always 10, 15, 20, 50 years if you Jacob Rees-Mogg, away. And we're facing a massive cost of living crisis now. The only impact on the economy since the end of the transition period has been negative. I was reading some articles on Anand's website earlier on, in fact, to kind of prepare for this, and was just looking at the fact that GDP has been hit by 5%. That equals 30 billion of the size and the value of the UK economy. That is huge. I mean, that is gigantic. And nobody on any side of the debate, Brexit, neutral or anti-Brexit, has come up with any idea as to how we're going to replace that without reintegrating with the EU. As Max also said, I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. There's zero chance, clearly, of former Remainer Liz Truss appearing on the steps of Number 10 and saying, hey, guys, we're going to rejoin. That really would be a turn up for the books, but it also isn't going to happen. I mean, they're going to keep riding the Brexit train because it works for them politically. It created, for Boris Johnson, it created with some admittedly quite substantial help from Jeremy Corbyn, it created an electoral coalition in 2019. That's an electoral coalition they're going to want to keep surviving. But what they're probably not going to do is diverge hugely from the EU, because every time we diverge, there are increased costs. We're putting additional costs on business. And again, from something I was reading earlier, I was just reminded of the fact that in both goods trade and services trade, so lawyers, architects, whatever, the average additional cost of them trading with the EU, which is still our largest trading partner, is 8 or 9%. That's a lot. I mean, that's going to completely destroy some people's pre-Brexit profit margins. They simply won't be able to function anymore. Or if they can function, far less profitably than they were before. These costs are not going to go away. And if we diverge, those costs just get bigger. So I would suspect that we will do little on divergence, but I would suspect that Liz Truss and her colleagues will keep talking about divergence, but not doing it, because talking about it keeps, in a way, will help them keep they hope will keep their electoral coalition together, but doing it, of course, would just make us all poorer.
I mean, we're talking about Liz Truss as well, how it'll obviously be quite a bit of a surprise if she turns around and says, right, we're rejoining the EU. Obviously, Keir Starmer has now is following that same rhetoric as well, saying that they want to pursue Brexit and they think that's the right course of action. Mike, was that a bit of a surprise for you on that element when Keir came out on that? Or do you think that's just not only the right political decision, or is actually something that should probably be continued?
I think it's the right political decision. I also think it's the only thing that he feasibly could say. Nobody at this point in the country wants to rehash the Brexit debate. Even Remainers don't. I think it's about 19 or 20% of the country wants another referendum to rejoin the EU, which is less than half of people voted Remain in 2016. Nobody wants the debate. Nobody wants to go through all the hassle again. We all remember the Brexit wars in Parliament. None of us want to relive it. I certainly don't want to relive it. It was all-consuming in all the wrong ways. But nonetheless, polls do consistently show that people don't like the Brexit deal that we've got. They don't think it's working. They think it's inadequate, and they think the solution is a closer relationship with the EU. And I think they're right. And that is effectively what Keir is offering. He's saying, we're not going to refight that fight because nobody wants to, and he's right, nobody does want to. But he is saying clearly that Boris Johnson's Brexit deal is inadequate, it is damaging the country, and that he would do something to fix it. Now, he hasn't given much detail on how he would do that yet. He painted some, quite limited and broad brushstrokes in his speech a few weeks ago, just before Boris Johnson stepped down. But that was the right thing to do. You can't say anything in one speech. Nobody wants a long list of changes that you're going to make to the trade and cooperation agreement on his speech on a Monday evening in a think tank. So that will, I'm sure, come later when, from his perspective, hopefully he's Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. But before then, nobody wants to go through all the hassle of having all the detail laid out in front of them.
No, I agree. Another kind of big concern that's kind of growing is kind of on the supply side, which is obviously affecting how the economy is. But obviously with strikes and dock workers expected to go on strike in the coming weeks, this is kind of a question for anyone, but how concerned should we be with supply chains in the UK at the moment? And what can we do, and how much of an impact has Brexit had on supply chains? We'd be really concerned about this in the current situation.
I mean, we obviously should be very concerned about it. The Brexit question is an interesting one and hard to answer. Of course, we haven't put in place the checks that we are meant to on goods coming in from the European Union as yet. So actually, there's far less friction for Europeans who export to us than there is for Brits who export to the European Union. That being said, there is some evidence that some European exporters have stopped exporting to us because they anticipated problems coming from Brexit. And the other issue, of course, is people. One of the issues we're facing is a labour market crisis, which is helping to drive prices up. And one of the reasons for that, it's not the major reason, but it is certainly one of the reasons, is because of the ending of freedom of movement, because it means we simply don't have access, if you think about sectors like agriculture, to that sort of rapid, cheap labour that we used to be able to get from the European Union. And the new schemes that have been put in place under the points-based system for some sectors don't apply in sectors like that. And so in those areas, I think they are having a real impact, which is why we get these stories about food rotting in fields.
It does seem to be, I think, as well, with Christmas coming. I wonder how much of a problem that is going to be. I know we kind of saw it last year, but I think obviously with, like, for example, turkey plucking, which is such a big industry in the UK, getting that labour is going to be another concern. So I completely agree with you. I mean, you've kind of talked about almost like agriculture kind of and farming seeing a benefit and also a negative. Is there any kind of industry or sectors that have really actually thrived and succeeded under Brexit? Is there any that have really seen the full extent of the success of Brexit? And is there any that have really been decimated so far, would you say?
Well, I mean, I go back to what Matthew and Mike said here. Firstly, with Mike, you need to weigh any success against the costs in terms of trade. So yes, there are areas where you might be able to, well, I should hope that we can regulate better than the common agricultural policy, because God help us if we can't. But there are areas where we will be able to do things better than the European Union, but at the cost of our ability to trade with the European Union. So you actually need to weigh those sides up. And at the moment, it's the costs of trading that we've seen rather than the benefits of regulation. The second thing I would say, going back to what Matthew said, is it's going to take a while to figure this out. Partly because not much has been done. There is the potential, for instance, for some gains to be had in financial services if we regulate differently from the European Union, because our financial services businesses are global. There are potential benefits to be had in terms of attracting inward investment in those areas like AI and robotics. But again, we haven't done that yet. Though my final point is, in those areas, the interesting question for me is, yes, we might be slightly more liberal when it comes to gene editing and attract some of that foreign funding that doesn't go to the European Union because of their restrictive regulations. But who the hell do we sell those goods to afterwards if those goods aren't allowed into the European Union's market? The final thing, is there is an issue there with Northern Ireland. Because if you imagine us having a more liberal regime when it comes to gene editing, we might well be manufacturing in Great Britain goods that are illegal on the market in Northern Ireland, which is something I think we need to probably just think about a little bit more than we have to date.
I suppose one thing that's kind of been a lot of discussion, as we kind of said, Liz Truss is kind of expected to win in the leadership challenge so far. certainly a lot of the polls kind of say. I suppose, Matthew, she's obviously been, foreign secretary. She's also been overseeing a lot of the trade deals that we've seen so far. I know this is going to be, as we keep saying, this will be a 10, 15, 20-year process, but the early deals that we're seeing right now, should we be optimistic about some of those trade deals that she's gotten, or should we actually be quite worried? And what's your kind of thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think actually she did well. I think it's as trade minister, and actually with the post Brexit trade deals, I think it's one of the big explanations for why she's about to become prime minister. We expect in 2 or 3 weeks' time, because she was a Remainer, was not particularly well known or not particularly well liked, well regarded within the Conservative Party, but she did well in that job and kind of pushed back against it. People on the other side of the debate spent a lot of time telling everyone that it would be impossible to do trade deals outside the EU, that we could never match the weight or the importance or the significance of the trade negotiations in Brussels. So she kind of pushed back against that and did some okay trade deals. I mean, I thought, it's still modest, it's still early days. I thought the Australian trade deal was actually a good example. Australia's not that important. You don't want to get too excited. Australia's a fairly small part of the global economy, but it was a good example of a slightly more liberal, a slightly different kind of trade agreement than I think the EU would have come up with. It had interesting stuff on freedom of movement between the two countries for people under the age of 30 and so on. So I think she did well with a kind of just a positive attitude towards Brexit. I don't think hopefully the big one to be a trade deal with the United States. That doesn't look like it's going to happen anytime soon. I think it's a big. She has a good attitude to it. She has quite a can-do and positive attitude to it. As I was just saying, there's still the issue of Northern Ireland to be sorted out. That's going to be a tough issue. She's going to have to grapple that at some stage. And then once we move beyond that, hopefully relationships with Brussels and the rest of the EU without the UK in it will sort of calm down, and all the kind of tempers and arguments of the years after the referendum will slightly fade into the background, and the UK and the EU can have a slightly more positive attitude. But yeah, I think she'll bring a fresh spirit to it. It'll probably help that she's not Boris Johnson, to be honest, because he was so identified with the referendum campaign and leading the Brexit movement that it was very, very hard for him to sort of build bridges in Europe and calm that relationship. So hopefully she can be positive about it, B, push forward to the trade deals, although it without the United States it's going to be tough to do any major ones, and also if she can get over the Northern Ireland issue, which is hard, and there's some tough talking to be had on that and some tough decisions to be made on both sides. Hopefully she by the mid 2020s, late 2020s, we can actually have a more positive, constructive relationship with the rest of Europe.
Mike, that's quite an optimistic viewpoint of especially Liz Truss coming in. I mean, with the murmurs of kind of in America of possibly that relationship not being quite as sunny between Liz Truss and Biden, would you kind of agree with that sentiment and her success so far and keep that optimistic tone, or what's your thoughts?
I mean, Biden and the whole of the US political scene, this is one of the few things that unites Republicans and Democrats. Their main concern will be over the settlements in Northern Ireland and Liz Truss's attitude and actions towards Northern Ireland and towards the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill. And at the moment, Liz Truss is on a collision course with the Biden administration, just as she's on a collision course with the EU, because their intention to follow through with putting the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill through Parliament will, in their eyes, break international law. It would endanger the settlement and the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland. And having spent quite a lot of time in Northern Ireland this year, there are a lot of people over there that would agree with the Biden administration and with the EU. What she's doing is, it's deeply dangerous in terms of Northern Ireland and community tensions there in the peace process. It's wholly undemocratic because the people in Northern Ireland don't get a say over whether the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill goes through Parliament, whether it doesn't, or whether if it does go through Parliament, it's implemented, or whether it isn't. In fact, it takes away the small piece of democracy that the people of Northern Ireland had, as in the scheduled Stormont vote as to whether the protocol should continue or not, that goes away or is severely reduced in impact because of the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill. So it's deeply undemocratic for those people. It's dangerous for their futures. No wonder the Biden administration, and him in particular, given his Irish background, and no wonder the EU are concerned about it. So as a result, I don't expect that Liz Truss coming in will do anything to improve the relationship between the UK and the EU. They will be looking at outcomes, not personalities. I would imagine that many of them are very pleased to see the back of Boris Johnson. But the thing is, they also know Liz Truss now. You know, she's been Foreign Secretary for quite some time. The EU tried, I think it was last October, to solve the issues over Northern Ireland and put forward a set of amendments, you know, changes to the way that the border would function, which went a long way. They went as far, they basically did everything that businesses in Northern Ireland asked them to do, which is far more than those business leaders expected. And the UK just rejected that offer out of hand. And the EU have been attempting to speak to the Foreign Office and speak to Liz Truss, you know, throughout all of this year. The last time they had any response from the UK and from Liz Truss was February this year. That's 6 months ago now. She's not engaging with us at all. She's using it. It would appear to me that she's using it for political purposes rather than actually trying to solve the problem. But I would love to hear her tell me otherwise.
Can I just come in on that?
Yeah, of course.
I mean, it's worth saying that this is an economic issue as well as a political one. I mean, it's an economic one in a minor sense, in the sense that uncertainty doesn't help businesses in Northern Ireland, but it's an economic issue in a major sense, in that if the EU if we decide to put the Northern Ireland bill into operation and we decide to suspend parts of the protocol, the EU will react, and ultimately that reaction might lead to suspension of parts of the trade agreement. So there is a prospect of the trading relationship between us and the European Union getting even worse. Now, Mike said something interesting talking about deregulation earlier, in the sense that he said, you know, politically, it makes sense to talk a lot about it, but not do anything, because then you get the political credit for talking about it, which Brexiters like to hear, but you don't run the economic costs of actually doing anything, which might damage the UK economy. The problem I see, because on the surface, that works for the protocol bill as well, doesn't it? Which is you can talk tough and secretly hope that the Lords sit on it for a year or so that you don't actually have to make any decisions. The problem with that, I think, and it'll be very interesting to see how this pans out in September, October, is the parliamentary party. There are people in the parliamentary party who simply will not be satisfied with talk and no action, either on regulatory divergence or when it comes to the protocol. And there it's going to be interesting to see what the balance of forces look like. Will the new Prime Minister get a honeymoon, not from the electorate, but from her own parliamentary troops to have a bit of space to negotiate? Or will that sort of pressure from ERG type Tories that has pushed so many Conservative Prime Ministers into positions they didn't want to be in, force her to see this bill through into law, and then force her to deal with the consequence, which could be something approaching a trade war with the European Union, which at a time of high and rising inflation is the last thing our economy needs?
I suppose it's also quite a concern that we're at the same time trying to negotiate new trade deals, while at the same time almost kind of not quite backing out, but at least creating a lot of tension with trade deals that we've kind of got with the EU. How much of a concern will that be for not only the economic impact if relations break down, but also for pursuing future trade deals?
Was that to me or to anybody?
That was kind of to the audience, to be honest. Well, to you guys.
Well, I mean, it would seem to me, I mean, say I was Joe Biden and sitting there in the White House thinking, should I do a trade deal with the UK? And the UK is at the same time seeking to rip up, or at least if it passes the bill, give itself the right to rip up a trade deal that it's signed only recently with another large international actor, that would give me pause. And I don't think Joe Biden would be the only one to think that. So again, it seems to me to be a bit of an own goal on Liz Truss's front. I do, however, agree, and just go back to something that Max said earlier on, I do actually agree that one of the reasons she's winning this, not the only reason, one of the reasons she's winning the leadership campaign is because since Brexit happened, she's been one of the few sources for Brexiters of good news. Her coming forward repeatedly with, I've got a new trade deal, I've got a new trade deal. Now, most of those, of course, were just rollovers from the EU, and most people don't know that or even don't care. Fine. But she has even got a couple of new ones. Now, unfortunately, the couple of new ones she's got with New Zealand and Australia do deep harm to the UK agricultural sector. But again, people don't really seem to mind that because they're just quite happy because she's got a new trade deal. And I understand that because it's narrative, and it's also her saying, look, I did something new and exciting that wouldn't have happened if we stayed in the EU. And of course, that's what people want to hear.
Yeah, I mean, just to jump in there, I mean, I would disagree. I mean, I think you're right about the trade deal. She's a politician and quite a good politician, which I guess is, one of the reasons she's probably going to be elected leader of the Conservative Party. It's leaders of party. It's good to have someone who's quite good at politics. So she did quite a bit of spin as trade secretary. She was, she was constantly wheeling out, I've got a new trade agreement with some little island you never heard of somewhere or other, and it turned out to become pasted for the EU one. Didn't amount to a good deal. She slightly overplayed it a little bit, but I disagree with you. I think on one point, I don't think she did deep damage to the UK agricultural sector. I think actually, one of the benefits of leaving the EU will be getting away from the common agricultural policy. As we were discussing a minute ago, I don't think anyone really thinks.
I'd advise you to speak to Minette Batters, who runs the National Farming Union.
Well, the National Farmers Union, do they really speak for the 67 million people in the UK, or do they just speak for a few farmers? I think we could have an interesting debate about that. You can't always
talking about. We're talking about farmers. They are the agricultural industry.
Well, but we're all consumers. We're all consumers of food, So I think there are much broader interests, and I think actually, if you look at it's an interesting debate to have, because I think actually one of the reasons why a lot of people, probably more on my side of the debate, actually came around to the view that the EU was worth leaving, was because of the way it's being captured by things like agricultural interests. If you look at the vast amount of money spent, as Anand was just saying a second ago, it's very hard from any kind of rational standpoint to defend the common agricultural policy as working in the best interests of everybody. So I think actually, she was quite brave in actually facing down the Farmers Union, who are an important influence within the Conservative Party. Bear that in mind. It's like, the T&G or the GMB are an important voice within the Labour Party. Within Conservative politics, the farmers are an influential voice, and I think to her credit, she hears them. But I don't think what the farmers want is actually in the interests of ordinary consumers or in the interests of the whole country. And I think she was right and reasonably gutsy to take on those interests, and they're probably not helpful for her politically. Probably lost her a few rural MPs. But she did the right thing, and that's an encouraging sign. I mean, I don't want to get overexcited over the Johnson premiership, which was pretty disappointing to people on the centre right, I think. But she is prepared to think original thoughts and to take on some vested interest. And as we go through this process of exiting from European regulation, we're going to have to do a lot more than that. So I think actually the trade deals, I mean, they're modest, as I said earlier. Australia is about 1% of global GDP, so you don't want to get too excited about it. But they were a hopeful sign. She did quite good deals, and hopefully as we press forward on that, we can do a few more.
Well, all of that may be true, but then you may agree that this trust was in selling it rather disingenuous, because she still is a great thing for Britain. What she didn't say is this is going to torch the UK's agriculture industry, which may not go down well with many voters, if any. I mean, I can't imagine that, selling one of our industries down the river is going to be a particular vote winner for the Conservative Party. And she also didn't sell it as, we're going to get worse quality food into the UK that you're going to then feed to your kids.
we can let's bring it on. Let's bring somebody. We can have a longer debate about agriculture and what a modern 21st century, mostly services based and industry based economy should be having as its agricultural society. But I think there are other. I think the important point I'd make is there are other voices to listen to than just the National Farmers Union. If you're talking about the transport system, if we're talking about having a modern transport system, it's no good just saying just listen to ASLEF. ASLEF could tell us everything about how the trade system should be run. We should be thinking, well, okay, that's a point of view. We'll listen to it. But maybe we do need driverless trains, for example. Maybe we don't. Maybe we do need tubes that run automatically. Maybe they'll be a little bit cheaper. Maybe we could afford to build a whole thing. So I mean, my point is the big point to make about this is that you shouldn't just listen to vested interests. That actually you should think about society more widely. And I'm very happy to debate agriculture for a little bit longer if we have time.
I think maybe that should be our next Bright Blue TV.
Maybe that deserves a 17-hour series all by itself, because it's a long and deep subject. We might lose a few viewers.
But you've still got to think about voters, haven't you, Matthew? I mean, that's the issue. If Labour came out in favour of driverless trains, and there are plenty of union people who would not vote Labour at the next election, and plenty of farmers back Brexit because they were
Yes,
told.
I agree with you. No, I mean, I agree with you, and lots of them did. I mean, but I think, listen, I'm sure you perfectly well the kind of arguments for free trade in food. I mean, as far as I do, I thought the UK had this argument in the 1840s. It was pretty bitter and divisive, and I think if I remember my history lessons, the free trade as well. But we seem to have kind of gone back to that argument, in favor of protectionism. I think it was good. I think it's a good sign in a politician that they take on some of their own side. It's usually it was to Tony Blair's credit. He had a mixed record as prime minister, and I wasn't always his biggest fan. But it was to his credit that he was willing at times to take on traditional labour sectors, particularly within the NHS, within the public sector, and to try and make some changes which weren't always popular on his side of the argument. And I think it's a good point for Liz Truss, an encouraging sign that she is willing. You can argue about the rights and wrongs of it, certainly in agriculture or one or two other areas, but I think it's a good sign that she's willing to take on, her own side a little bit. And the best politicians, do that. I think Blair did that, on some occasions quite well. I think Mrs. Thatcher did that on some occasions quite well. Politicians have to do that occasionally. It'd be good if Keir Starmer did it occasionally, but not much sign of it.
Oh, yeah, we've had quite a long conversation now on kind of how the Conservatives will manage to keep working with groups that they may be pushing against with Brexit, which is actually going to be my final question. So you kind of guys got onto it by yourselves, which is pretty good. So I'm quite happy with that. I mean, I'm just going to ask for the last question in kind of tying things up. It's kind of like a short, kind of one answer to kind of finish up this session. But other than agriculture, because I think we could spend the whole day talking about agriculture, as you said, there's so many elements to where the UK maybe could try and look towards the EU. There's certainly quite a few ways to try and divulge. Which kind of area do you think Liz Truss needs to try and focus on divulging the most to? And which element do you think it needs to try and actually cozy up to EU regulation and should not scrap that type of regulation? Is there any of the two? Anand, why don't we start with you?
Okay, sure.
I mean, in terms of just ease, I think a closer relationship on agriculture and veterinary standards would help ease the protocol quite remarkably. I see the argument for control, the sort of democratic and philosophical argument for control. I never understood why SPS arrangements became such a fundamental matter of principle. I mean, signing up to an SPS deal could resolve the protocol. So that's the area where I'd see trying to be a bit closer to the European Union would yield immediate benefits in terms of removing that prickly issue of the protocol. Divergence, as I said before, I think financial services is the obvious area. I think we've heard a lot of ludicrous claims about what changing some EU directives might mean for the average British punter, but I think there is scope to make the British financial services industry more competitive globally if the regulation is done right. And of course, that is the big if about all of this. Yes, there are regulatory gains to be had if you believe that we are capable of regulating better than others. And that's obviously going to be crucial.
Matthew, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think we should be diverging. As Andrew just said, in particularly in financial services, that's obviously a big one. I think particularly in technology, in things like life sciences and artificial intelligence and robotics, I think there are big gains because I think the EU has a very poor record of regulation. I think it comes up with bad regulatory systems. I think it's an important point. It was just made. Can we regulate better than the EU does? But I think in certain areas of technology, you couldn't do any worse. I don't think it's a coincidence that the EU has fallen so far behind the United States and now China in technology. That wasn't true of the first, second industrial revolutions. It was, in front or level with the rest of the world. And in the third one, it's been way behind. I think it has a poor system of regulation. So I think, we should be breaking away as much as we can in those kind of areas, and probably in in manufactured goods, we should probably be trying to cozy up and get close to them and just try and make things easier for companies in those sectors. Things like manufacturing, they're not the future for the UK. We're not going to get huge growth out of manufacturing, but we have important manufacturing industries, and it's important that they do well. And Europe's going to be a big market and a close market, so we should try and be getting along with our partners as closely as possible. And actually, even we were just having an argument about agriculture. But the thing you've got to remember is, I think I haven't got the figure in front of me. I have looked it up in the past. It's 1.5%, 1.7% of UK GDP. So, we had an interesting little discussion about it. But it's never going to be. You're never going to transform, a modern 21st century economy by anything you do in the agricultural sector, because it's just not that. It's just not that big. So, it's important, but I wouldn't get into too many needless arguments with the people in Brussels about it, because there probably aren't huge gains to be had from it.
Perfect. Mike?
I'd agree with Anand on SPS checks and veterinary, because that would go a long way to resolve the difficulties over the protocol. And just to follow on what he was saying over, sovereignty and control or whatever. Well, we have sovereignty now, we have control, and we always did actually in reality, but we certainly do now, whether we did before or not. Well, we can now use that control to decide to enter into an agreement, and that doesn't rob the UK of any sovereignty. And we can then choose to leave that agreement in the future if we want to. So I don't see there would be any. I don't see why this is such a problem, to be honest with you, other than it may send a signal to people that Liz Truss doesn't want to send a signal to, that she's rowing back on Brexit. And of course she won't do that, regardless of the advisability or the sensible nature of the choice or not. Financial services, possibly an area to diverge, but having spent a lot of time speaking to different groups and organisations in the City of London over this year, there are very different views amongst that group of people as to whether it would be advisable or whether these benefits are actually real or would outweigh any costs. One of the things that we always need to think about in terms of shall we diverge or not diverge is, well, yeah, there might be a benefit, but what's the consequent cost? Because there's always likely to be one. And then, my final thought on divergence is, well, it's inevitable. If we stay still, the EU is not staying still. It is implementing new laws. It's changing. It's growing. It's developing. It's further integrating all the time. So we always now will need to choose: do we keep pace with them? Do we kind of tack along with them, or do we not? And if we don't, there are consequences to that. And those consequences, even if we stay exactly where we are, may be to increase costs on British exporters, importers, producers of goods, sellers of services, or whatever. So there's a lot of government time, forever, basically, is going to be taken up with thinking this stuff through. And I guess one of my thoughts is, well, goodness me, what else could that government time be spent on? But here we are.
I'm actually going to ask, and it's going to be a one-word question, one-word answer on this. Who is the best candidate to lead us forward for Brexit? If we're thinking just about trying to secure the best possible future for Brexit, if I give you Keir Starmer, Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak, and Boris Johnson, I wonder if people will say him. Who do we think is actually the best as the final kind of summarise? And Mike, we'll go the opposite direction. So Mike, who do you think might be best?
I will go with Keir Starmer. There are lots of reasons why I would go with Keir Starmer, but the obvious one that springs to mind is he's the only one of those four that wouldn't be in hock to the ERG. It would actually have some freedom of manoeuvre.
Interesting. Matthew?
I'll go Liz Truss. Since you asked for a one-word answer, you get one word.
And Anand?
I'm tempted to bottle this a bit, simply because Brexit is relatively trivial in terms of the scale of the problems we face. I have to say, I've not been impressed by the current debate over the leadership and what it has, or rather hasn't had, to say about the cost of living crisis, but neither have I been particularly impressed by the opposition over it either, to be honest.
Fair enough. Well, thank you so much for joining us today for Bright Blue's episode. It's been a fantastic and really in-depth discussion. I've really enjoyed listening to all three of our guests. So thank you very much, Anand Menon, Mike Buckley, and Matthew Lynn for joining us for today's episode. And we look forward to seeing you next time.